Workers, what's the dumbest reason a job ever fired you? In the days after 9/11, my employer, multinational bank, instantly fired the last two people hired in every department where there was redundancy, hedging against a financial collapse whenever the markets reopened. I just happened to be the last guy hired in my debt at Story 2 for surfing the internet. Punchline. Part of my job was to surf the internet and find content for their social media platforms. I wish I was making that up. I am not. Story 3, not fired, but let go with severance. CFO told me to make up historical reports because they weren't done in the past, but now required, and wanted to show how so much better metrics are now than in the past. What they were asking for was literally not possible to do since the data was not tracked to what they were asking, and wanted to tweak the past numbers into a full-on made-up breakdown. I told the controller I wasn't comfortable doing this. Next week got paid out a month later. I found out the CFO was canned. Story 4, worked at a Foot Locker way back. Manager says to me, "Hey, if you have some free time this weekend, another store could use some help. Let me know if you are able to help out." I turned that down as I had other plans on the weekend. Show up on Monday, and he asks why I didn't show up to help out the other store over the weekend. I reminded him. I said no and that I had other plans on the weekend. Man, you should have told me that before. They were expecting you to show up and help out. Since you didn't show, I'm going to have to write you up for that and let HQ know. Got fired after that shift ended. Stole some shoes and clothes, walked out and never went back there again. Story 5. Pandemic forced everyone to work from home on hastily set up computers and infrastructure. Then they fired the IT staff because we were deemed non-essential. Story 6. I had an alcoholic handyman who was promoted to manager. He fired me several times a week for not bumming him a cigarette or not wanting to work the second dining room when we had 5 reservations or taking my approved unpaid time off. I just come back the next day. Story 7. I was 17. My grandpa died unexpectedly from a heart attack. My mother called my work's office to let me know. I was called to the office to talk on the office phone to my mother, and staff, who were told what was going on, left the area so my mother could privately break the news to me. I was obliterated, of course, and walked outside for about 15 minutes to clear my head. I then went back to work. The woman who was in charge of the entire operation fired me for leaving the building. Human resources stepped in and stopped the situation before I could be notified that I had been fired. I only found out that this had happened after my grandpa's funeral days later. I quit immediately. Story 8. I was 16 and accused of following a coworker home on a regular basis. I explained that it's gonna keep happening because they kept scheduling us on the same shift, and she lived up the street from me, but that wasn't good enough for them. Story 9. Hired as a busboy in a bar/club. I showed up, asked the owner boss what I would be making. He cursed me up and down and had me thrown out. Total time working there, 5 minutes. Story 10. I worked at Walmart while I was in high school, and one of the managers kept scheduling me to open or for me to be there at 2. I told them many times that I was in high school and those shifts wouldn't work. I guess they didn't get that memo. The store manager fired me for missing work and being late. Story 11. I refused to endorse a paper because it was missing key data and a method. I guess the department head wanted it rubber stamping for funding, and I have my integrity. Story 12. Arbitrarily fired from video game job because of someone else's mistake. I wrote a video game script for a small developer. They forgot to tell me when they started voice work. Part of my job required me to help with voice acting session. I finally was invited to a session with a big-name actor, especially known in video games. The director asked me why I hadn't been present for the past 2 weeks' worth of recording. Apparently, telling the truth that no one had told me recording had begun was the wrong move. The developers fired me the next day despite my work already being done, which essentially meant I'd have no part in DLC or sequels. They didn't forget to invite me. They just wanted me out of the way while they brought in their yes man. Story 13. I used to work as a waiter at Steak and Shake back in high school. I put in our books like 3-4 months in advance that I would be out of town for one particular weekend. When that week came up, the manager that did the scheduling put me on a shift for that weekend. I told her, "Hey, I can't work this shift. I put in the books I wouldn't be available a long time ago." She said, "Oh, don't worry about it. I'll take care of it." Got a call that weekend while I was out of town. It was that manager. She was firing me for being a no-show, ducking a hole. Story 14. As a consultant, a company ended my contract early. Not fired, but let go. I was hired by the company to help them save money. I did indeed help them cut costs in areas that were not needed, help restructure some areas, and help consolidate key parts of the business without having to fire anyone or let anyone else go. Some people did move to full-time status to part-time. The company did not like this. They thought they were just gonna let people go and continue as normal. No, they ended the contract early. Joke's on them. I still get paid and billed the same if I was there for a day or for the full time, allotted of 3 months. I worked 1 month and got paid for 3. So put that down your pipe and smoke it. Story 15. Because I asked for time off to go to a family reunion, they denied it, and I went anyway. I was a 17-year-old summer employee and told them it was going to happen when I started at the beginning of the summer. I literally didn't have a choice about going or not. Don't hire 17-year-olds and then try to fight their parents through the 17-year-old. Story 16. Way back in the day, our boss came in and fired all 3 employees for no reason. He had other store locations, so he brought in someone from another store. If I had to guess, it was because we'd all started around the same time and we were all soon eligible for our week of vacation time. It all worked out though, because we were able to draw unemployment. And due to the economy at the time, they extended it for a good while. I also reported him to the labor board for a few various reasons, and he had to go through an investigation and pay fine. A few months later, I heard from a former coworker that he was in rehab for substance. Story 17. Technically not fired, as I resigned, but they were going to not renew my contract. As a teacher, we had 12 days you could take off. My mother had extreme stages of cancer at the time and ended up falling unconscious for 2 weeks and then dying. The principal calls me as I'm in the ICU with my dying mother to tell me I was out of days. She died 2 days later, and I took 2 extra days off unpaid. They didn't renew my contract because I wasn't reliable. No lies. I filed for unemployment, even though teachers usually can't get it when non-renewed, but duck them. We were in hospital for our firstborn child. Later that year in October, when Dole Unemployment called to verify my case, I told the person on the phone what happened, and he didn't say anything for a good 20 seconds and finally goes, "What the hell?" I said, "Yep." He goes, "I'm going to get this written up ASAP so I can turn it in for you." They call back a week later and are like, "No question, you got approved." They tried contesting it, but the unemployment office shut them down with a quickness. "We're so sorry to hear about your circumstances and can't imagine someone, let alone a principal school district, acting in that manner." Story 18. I was a service shop apprentice as part of my vocational school internship program. I was required to complete some months of work in order to get my diploma, but so did everybody else, so trade school internships are unpaid. So I worked at a dealership for 6 straight months with no pay. Near the end of the internship, the rest of my coworkers begged the manager to hire me and keep me there, but he thought he could just keep on getting free labor from the endless stream of kids coming out of trade schools needing to complete their mandatory work hours. So I was let go, and in the following year, they went through multiple free apprentices who, in their words, simply didn't cut it. For one reason or another, they just couldn't provide the same level of work as I did, and they didn't gel with the rest of the employees in there like I did. Most of them didn't even get to complete their mandatory 6-month period and were cut short. Productivity tanked. As for close to a year, the experienced mechanics had to routinely stop what they were doing and do assistant tasks instead, which are simple but essential to the smooth operation of a workshop. This was just one of the manager's bright ideas to save on operating costs and try to appear good to upper management. However, in practice, in his attempt to cut corners for a few $100 here and there, the store's productivity and overall revenue tanked, and they saw a lot of loyal customers abandon them. The manager was fired around a year after I was. I still visit my old co-workers from time to time because we actually had great chemistry and a pleasant work environment. They have asked me to come back, but my current job pays better, and they're not willing to match that. Story 19. I got fired from a supervisor job at an amusement park because I was too friendly with the staff. The staff member in question was my girlfriend, and had been my girlfriend the day we both came in and applied for jobs at the same time with the same person who fired me. We just didn't like each other, which was fine. In hindsight, I think he had a thing for my GF. Joke was on him though. The woman who ran the cash office had used me as a temp fill-in several times, counting money and manning the window that supervisors came to for change. I ran into her while I was turning in my radio, and she offered me a full-time job on the spot. So I went from walking around outside in 90-degree weather with high humidity, dealing with crowds of dip craps, to sitting in an air-conditioned office all day. And unlike the previous job, I could now coordinate breaks so my Jeff and I could eat meals and hang out even more. Story 20 was working at Casey's. Fools in Missouri love Casey's pizza. Anyway, I was working a night shift, a new kid working the kitchen. It was his first job. That night we got mobbed and we had like 3 hours wait times on our pizza. I had worked at a pizza place before, so I'm running from register to kitchen, trying to make pizza and check out customers. By the end of the shift, I was covered in flour and a million complaints had come through. Show up the next morning and my boss says, "There was money missing from your drawer." I said, "I didn't take anything. Watch the camera." He said, "I did, and I know you didn't, but you're still fired." I lit the mother ducker up and let him know what a worthless piece of crap is, and that, in fact, none of these young female employees want anything to do with your fat, dip-filled, tooth-missing mouth. Left and had a seizure. Duck Casey's Story 21. Because my name appeared in a business proposal template. I worked for an oil and gas company whose founder was hyper-paranoid and unafraid of suing people at the drop of a hat. He was also a tyrant, and the company atmosphere was toxic. But the money was good, so I stuck around. I became friends with several people in the company, including the sales manager, who I'll call Todd. Todd became disillusioned with the company after a year or so. He also became close with the quality control manager, who I'll call Spaz, because that's what he was. Todd and Spaz decided they wanted to start their own company. And because it's all they knew, they decided to go into the same oil and gas niche our employer was in. Unfortunately, neither Todd nor Spaz knew how to start a company. The furthest they got in their scheme was to open a business proposal Word template and type a business name in the header that was suspiciously similar to our employer's. They also decided they would hire a few of us coworkers and add our names to the document. Of course, one of those names was mine, and I had no idea. Our employer, as I said, was hyper-paranoid, so he had people reading all of our intranet chats, emails, and files on our company devices. They quickly found the document on Todd's laptop, Decide 2 + 2 = 12, and decided to fire every name in the document. And they sued all of us for theft of intellectual property. I was blindsided. Thankfully, while I was stunned, my wife hired an attorney, and we countersued for harassment. The suit dragged out for a year and a half before both sides decided to settle for nothing. It was all a giant waste of time for no goddamn reason. Story 22. I went to Auburn for undergrad and worked in the deli at Winn-Dixie for extra cash. I didn't need the job. It was just for beer money. Anyways, it was a requirement that you work 2 weekends a month. I would schedule my shifts off for football games, but one month I was scheduled to work one of my 2 weekends during the Auburn-Velsu game. I worked mostly with women in their 50s and 60s who didn't care about football, so I had one of them agree to work for me during the game, and I would cover any of her weekend shifts she wanted after football season. We changed the schedule, and the manager of the Winn-Dixie, who was a Bama fan, pulled me into the office, told me I wasn't allowed to work fewer than 2 weekends per month. I explained the agreement with my coworker, no excuse, blah, blah, blah. He told me I was expected to show up that day. I politely said I wouldn't be there, regardless of what the schedule said, so he told me to grab my stuff, leave, and never come back. I went to the game, watched Cam Newton drag Patrick Peterson into the end zone, and continued going to every game, watching Auburn with the national championship while the Winn-Dixie Deli was short-staffed the rest of the season. Duck Winn-Dixie and Duck Bama, Story 23. About 6 months after Sobeys bought out a grocery store chain I had been working at for over 3 years as a teenager through high school, there were issues being discussed over how much profit was being lost. Rather than thinking it's because they booted up prices like crazy so less customers chose to shop there, they decided it must be employees stealing. So they set up cameras secretly in all the stores. I personally was fired for eating one of the free cookies in the bakery department I worked in, and about 5 others were fired for drinking the coffee that was to be dumped once new batches were to be brewed. Duck you Sobeys, Story 24. Being late 1 minute from lunch, and then sometime later, less than 30 minutes BC of a traffic stop. I got this one job at an IT call center that was contracted by IBM. They were super about being on time. This was during the month of training. I was always on time until one day I came back from lunch, literally 1 minute late. I walked into our area at 12:31. I had to pretty much run from McDonald's to get there on time. We only had 30 minutes. They were super serious about it and said that was my warning. Then maybe a couple weeks after that, I got a traffic ticket for turning left during certain hours, and I was unaware BC. I never had gone down that street during those hours. Well, I got to work a little late. It was less than 30 minutes late. They told me I was fired. What a crap hole job. I had just finished college, and this was after the Great Recession. And to add to it, they tried to not pay me. I called the State Department of Labor and told them about it. And they said, don't worry, and called the HQ and got me my check. Pro tip, if any employer ever tries to short you or not pay you, call your state's Department of Labor. They'll fold real quick. Story 25. I was working 2 part-time jobs, one in the AM, one in the afternoon. Afternoon job calls me up to tell me they need me to come in and cover for somebody else, except I was literally working the other job because it was 9 a.m. Apparently that made me unreliable and not willing to work with a team. Another dumb one I actually quit. The owner's wife was my manager. She started writing down all my infractions. These included going down the street to Panera during my lunch break and using the entire 30 minutes to eat and actually take a break. My husband came by to bring me coffee one day as a surprise. He stayed for about 10 minutes and 0 other people came in the shop. I had work going the entire time, starting the job 2 hours late on my first day because her husband never told her I had a doctor's appointment that morning, using a different malware detection process than the guy I replaced. She was old and didn't want to adapt. Coming in at 8:05 because I got stuck behind a train. Other dumb crap I can't remember now. This was all in a 4-week period. I knew it would only get worse if I stuck around. That was like 10 years ago, and I'm still annoyed by it. Story 26. One of my first jobs after military was at a mom and pop computer store putting PCs together for orders. I had some hardware training in the Navy, and it isn't even that hard to figure out, really. So I was slaying it, throwing boxes out as the orders came in or display computers got sold. I started getting some cash saved up, so I was like, duck it. I'll support where I work and get a machine through them. I asked how much their computers sold for and what upgrades were available. They fired me the next day because they thought I was a plant from a competitor. They assumed because I was doing way better than expected and asking all these questions I was spying for someone. I was like, oh, what? Had no idea what to say. State is right to hire whatever it is, so there wasn't much I could have done even if I had the resources to. I still laugh about my James Bond job, though. Story 27. New company bought out the company I worked for 10 years. Before the new company came, I was hourly, working 60 hours a week. New company came in and wanted to switch everyone to salary. Their solution was to give everyone a 10% raised over their base pay. Problem is, even after the 10% raise, I was bringing home less each week. They still wanted me to work the same amount of hours. So they expected me to take a pay cut after 10 years and still work the same amount. I said no, they laid me off a couple weeks later. My dad worked there for 43 years and built the company to what it was. I learned from him, and we basically ran the entire production and understood the product better than anyone in the company. My dad retired just after the company got bought out. Once I was gone, the company went under not 6 months later. No one understood the product and the custom work we did to make the product fit customers' needs. Geitz bit themselves in the foot by forcing out the two people that built the company's reputation. Duck them, guys. Story 28, IM wouldn't sleep with my boss. He used other reasons, but that's the bottom line. Technically, it wasn't being fired. But I worked at a cell phone store that was the most successful of the franchises in the city. West Edmonton Mall's location was mismanaged and failing. They swapped the entire staff of both locations thinking that would fix it. We told the district manager we didn't want to work there. His response was, "You are dogs. When I say jump, you jump them." 20 years of cellular sales experience, including the manager, quit within 3 weeks. Story 29. I was told I cared too much. For context, I told the manager that I was upset with him for completely changing my schedule around and giving all my hours to the new girl without telling me, and expecting me to be okay with it after I had expressed upon being employed that my hours were non-negotiable. My original hours were Monday, Friday, 10 and 5, and I was put on WedSun 11. Completely upended my crap, so yeah, I was pissed. Story 30. I worked for a jeweler's about 10 years ago. The place got robbed while I was in the back, oblivious to it happening, fixing a battery into a watch. After the robbery ended and the police arrived, I was informed that I was fired because the company always fires everyone if there's a robbery. It's in case there was an insider helping the robbers. So basically, I lost my job because I went to work and did my job correctly. Story 31. I used to work for a snack food manufacturer. They like to hire temps and then let them go just before the end of the 90-day probation period so that they had a constant full-time workforce without having to offer them benefits. I was let go just before my scheduled hire date for doing exactly what I was told to do: stand in front of a conveyor and switch out boxes once they had been filled to the proper weight. They said I should have taken more initiative to work harder during the times the line was down, anywhere from 5 minutes to an hour while I worked there. I pointed out that aside from sweeping the floor, which I did, in order to find something else to do, I would have to abandon my station and wander into a different part of the factory, where I wouldn't know when the line started back up, and there was no one to come find me. No supervisors or team leads hung out to watch us fill boxes. So I also was never given any other instructions. They said that if I had to ask or be told, I wasn't the sort of person they'd want to hire anyway. I didn't find out until later that rolling layoffs were just the way they did business. Story 32. I left pool noodles outside on accident. I had only been at Dollar Tree for a month and was used to closing to another manager who always brought them in. I forgot once. Story 33. I clocked out, stepped off the property onto the street. 2 drunk guys started to pick a fight with me. A coworker came to my rescue and helped me defend myself. A fight ensued. The story came out the following business day, and a manager started an investigation on me and my coworkers. They saw us fighting on their shipping receiving area camera that had view to the public street. We both got fired for defending ourselves after clocking out and being off our job's property. Story 34. The memories. Let's see. Third job I ever had at 18, my friend worked for a cleaning company who cleaned office buildings. So he got me in for a job. There was no interview. I think I just did it all by phone maybe. But anyway, I show up to the job site, some big bank I think, main guy gives instructions and we dust and we dust and we dust, etc. Then instruction guy takes me for a powwow over a can of Coke in the break room. So why you want to work for us? Why you want to be an office cleaner? Money? Plus, my mom's kind of on my ass to get a job. Apparently, I was supposed to pretend this was the job of a lifetime, and I was supposed to answer these questions like it was an entrance exam for a fancy college. Because the very next day, the owner rings me up to pay him a visit at their HQ, and he immediately tells me I'm fired, and I was just like, okay. Then, whilst walking out, next time, don't tell an employer you want a job because of your mom, my text for the Great Life Lesson Trust Fund Prima Donna We Cleaning Co. Story 35. I was working a double shift at a well-known burger spot. I had a table from the morning lunch shift that was hanging out and had already paid but wouldn't leave. The restaurant was practically empty. I was about to start an 8-hour shift, so I ordered my lunch. My coworkers were sitting down and eating, and my food was ready. I asked the remaining table if they were good, and they told me they were fine, just hanging out, and they didn't need anything else. My manager walks by and looks at me and goes, "Are you eating during your shift?" I told him, "Yes. My last table is all paid for, and I'm just waiting for them to leave so I can clean it." He got red in the face, but ultimately laughed and told me I was ducking fired. Not quite sure he ever really liked me. He ended up passing away of brain cancer a few years later. Getting fired for eating quickly when out of view of customers and you've already done your part in actually serving your table is silly to me. I was paid something like $2 an hour, if that. All of my money was from tips. Story 36. I had an average 2.5-hour commute to work in Southern California. Depending on accidents, it could extend to 4 hours. My arrival time was unpredictable. It worried me. I asked my boss on a couple occasions if I needed to just leave 4 hours early every day so that I was always there by 8 a.m. He repeatedly assured me that it was fine as long as I put in my 8 hours every day. It didn't matter when I arrived. One day I got there before anyone else and found that my login didn't work. Eventually, my boss came in and told me I'd been fired for repeated tardiness. When you are in a high visibility position like this, you need to be punctual, he said. I was a ducking billing clerk. I basically did data entry. I asked him what happened to it being okay to arrive when I arrived, as long as I put in my 8 hours. HR apparently doesn't agree with that. It was their decision to fire you, not mine. The guy was a spineless git who wouldn't tell HR that he'd okayed my inconsistent arrival times. I wasn't given a pip or any kind of warning. Story 37. As a bartender and not technically fired, I was suspended for a week, and then my boss literally never spoke to me again. My long-distance Jeff was in town, and as I was closing, she rolled a joint in a side dining room, open to the public. The only people in house were staff and 2 of my friends. We locked up and walked out, and she smoked it in the street, legal in CO, off property, but in view of cameras. As we ran into a bunch of people we knew who were walking home from dinner. I got pulled aside next shift and suspended because this isn't that kind of bar, whatever that means. Maybe she shouldn't have rolled it in the house, but I don't smoke weed. I don't know the rules. I personally didn't do it, and when she did smoke it, it was off property and legal. I was suspended for a week, fine. When the week was up, my boss didn't respond to any emails, texts, or phone calls and simply never scheduled me again. He smokes too, and a large number of our staff and clientele were involved in the substances industry. I'm still confused. Story 38. Best friend and coworker pass. In an accident after work on Friday, Monday was the funeral. I could not give 2 weeks notice for a day off, went anyway and got fired. Story 39. I worked in a warehouse one summer in college stocking pallets and came down very ill one Thursday evening. I called in Friday morning, about 20 minutes before my shift was supposed to start at 8:30, but no one answered. I called in every 10 or 15 minutes after that until about 10:30, when someone in the office finally answered and told them I was out sick. Monday morning I show up and my time card isn't there. I go to the office to ask why, and they tell me I've been fired. What for? I ask. You didn't call in sick on Friday until 10:30, they reply. I say no, I called in before my shift started, and multiple times after, no one answered until 10:30. They respond with, "You should have left a message," and had me escorted from the building. It would have been nice of them to call and let me know not to come in before I made the 40-minute commute, just to find out I was fired, turn around, and drive 40 minutes home. Story 40. Try to figure this one out. I interviewed with a company in Little Rock, was offered and accepted the position. On the way home from the interview, the director of the manager who hired me offered me a better position for almost double the salary, which I enthusiastically accepted. 4 days later, was filling out the required paperwork online and was asked by the person in HR what my started date was. I replied I wasn't given that information yet. She replied that she would find out. A few minutes later, she replied that my started date was Monday the 19th, which to me was a bit odd, because it was by then Tuesday the 26th. I forwarded this email to the HR manager and italicized the words started date and asked how it was possible for my started date, the 19th, to occur before my date of hire, the 23rd. The next day, my offer of employment was rescinded, meaning I was hired by a company, promoted, given a raise, and fired, and I never worked one day. That is an honest-to-goodness, absolutely true story. Story 41. Okay, so I was not fired, but my contract was not extended for an incredibly stupid reason. So I was a summer worker at a steel factory last summer, operating a cooling platform. The reason my contract was not extended until late autumn or early winter is that the company shot itself in the foot. They were making record profits in the first quarter, and their stock was the most profitable one in the country. Then they got greedy, raised the prices, and suddenly got way less orders by the summer. And thus from the top came an order to not extend any summer workers' contracts for the whole section, which is something that usually happened. Now, approximately half of the production line of one of the largest steel factories in the world is undermanned. They got greedy and got what was coming for Tim. Story 42. Not my story, but my co-workers, whom I helped get retribution. I work at an art and music charter school where admin makes some questionable decisions. At the start of the new school year, it was clear they had admitted too many new students and the art/music classroom was getting the axe to split up the now too large 5th grade class. The options were either to rent a room from the church next door, which they had done previously, add a 3rd trailer behind the building, or to put art and music on rolling carts. They chose the carts, in a building with no elevators. Unfortunately, the art teacher has fibromyalgia and limited mobility and would physically not be able to do this. She fought back and suddenly she didn't have a job because of some allegations by an anonymous student. So the school violated ADA laws and ruined the art teacher's reputation, and they paid for it handsomely via the lawyer I helped her find. She's happily retired now. I stay for the kids. Duck admin, story 43. I was consistently 30 to 40 seconds late clocking back in from lunch. I was a butcher at Sam's Club. For my hour-long break, I'd have to walk from the back of the store to the time clock, then leave the store and walk to the far end of the lot to sit in my car and eat. I'd cut my hour break short by 15 minutes to make the walk back to the time clock, and inevitably there would be 3 or 4 workers in front of me clocking back in. So by the time I clocked in, it was 7:01:14 instead of 7:45. Bean counters on the other side of the nation decided to fire X amount of employees across the board, and riding the clock was the easiest way to do it. My manager really relied on me, and I'd been Employee of the Month numerous times, never called in sick or asked for time off, etc. So the manager called Corp and demanded I be allowed to continue working, but no dice. Story 44. I had a minimum wage job at a coffee shop. I wanted a full-time job, but they only gave me part-time hours, early morning shifts. No problem. I'll just get a second job for the afternoon. Fine, right? Shifts for the afternoon job started over 2 hours after my regular morning shift at the coffee shop ended. There was zero chance of schedule conflict. Not fine, apparently. They fired me after it came up that I'd gotten an afternoon job. Never mind that they had never, literally never, not even for training, scheduled me on an afternoon shift. Simply not having the option to give me afternoon shifts was a fireable offense. Story 45. I was working as a personal trainer for a fairly large, swanky gym. The general manager was interested in one of my clients. She and I quietly started dating, and about 3 weeks later, I was out of work based on completely peripheral and fully erroneous complaints from other members. Worked out for me, she became my wife, and we have an amazing, now 21-year-old, son together. Story 46. I worked in a French language restaurant and spoke French with a broad UK Midlands accent. I was good at waiting tables, just absolutely ruining the immersion. The owners completely hated me, speaking my somewhat capable Brummie. For Americans, Birmingham, UK accent, French. They kept demoting me further from the customers, until they just fired me from being a completely silent potwash. They were nice about it, but I was utterly terrible at accents. It was fair, really. Story 47. I got hired to manage a store. When I was hired, I asked what happened to the previous manager, and the person who hired me told me, oh, the girls who work here were lying about her so much she just decided to quit. Big red flag, but I just sort of said whatever. 3 months into the job, I get pulled into my own office by the district manager to let me know that screaming at the employees will not be tolerated. I never screamed at any of these bozos. Told my manager that, and he said, if it happens again, we will let you go. Sure enough, after a week of not yelling at anyone, they came in and fired me. They tried to fight my unemployment claim, and I won. Pandemic unemployment bonus had me on $1,475 every 2 weeks for doing nothing. I actually really liked the job, but the firing was the best thing that could have happened to me at the time. Story 48. I wasn't fired, but I was told why I wasn't hired. Back when I was barely 17, I applied for a job with Fred Meyer in the little town I grew up in. I took the application and filled it out. The interview was to be after a short 30-minute wait, during which I was to fill out a small section. It was questions about being a register operator, and I finished it in 10 minutes and politely took it back to the supervisor of the area, sat back down and waited. 15 minutes passed, and she came out and said I was ineligible to be hired because I was too honest with my answers concerning till shortages and wanting to be accurate. So I must have been lying. Therefore, I was unable to be hired. After that, I didn't shop in a Fred Meyer store for 20 years and instead shopped elsewhere. Safeway, Winco, Wearmart, and IGA's. Story 49, I had to take a week off when my mom had an aneurysm, was put on life support, and then died a few days later. But I was still in their probation period. Story 50, I worked at a drive-through coffee stand for 2 years, and in my entire time working there, I only ever called out of work one single time. And it was because I was sick with pandemic. I tried to call out an earlier time while sick that week, and they told me if I didn't come in, I was fired, so I ended up going in super sick, which I know is a bad idea. I was one of their most reliable employees and never missed a day. Then later that week, I had thrown up 5 times before it was time for my shift and could not stand up and had no choice but to call out. I got fired 2 days later. All because I missed 1 day of work in 2 years over being sick, story 51. I worked at a baseball stadium right after high school back in 2008 and was there a couple seasons, but in around 2015, one of my lady coworkers was having a bad day and I tried to de-escalate the situation. She snapped and called me an idiot. I got mad, I flipped her off and included a verbal, "duck you." She went to the supervisor and told them what had happened. I said my side of story on a written paper, and I ended up getting fired while she kept her job. They actually suspended her though with pay, and she was back at the job after like a month of investigation with pay. I got fired. Story 52, I was offered a job by a competitor. I did not solicit the offer, but my company fired me anyway. It took 5 days of dealing with my direct boss, his boss fired me, to get my job back. I stayed 6 months, set up a much better job, and got the duck out of there to the company I'm currently with. I've been with that company 12 years next week. Story 53, this was almost a decade ago. I wouldn't turn off the stereo playing NPR in the coffee shop. As explicitly stated in the 3-page employee manual they gave me, it actually said the music had to remain on and that it had to be the NPR classic music channel. A lady complained one Sunday morning when NPR was playing Baroque music, and as a Jewish lady, she felt she shouldn't have to listen to Christian music while she sipped her latte. I offered to turn the music down, but she insisted I turn it off entirely. I wouldn't. So she complained to management later, and that's the reason they gave me. Story 54. Because I told a customer that we had something more important to do than call another store and ask if they still have a certain dessert 15 minutes after closing time. And while my coworker had been counting the register since before the customer entered, which the customer knew. Complaint went directly to regional management, who fired me on the spot without consulting or informing anyone in the store. Story 55. I used to be a cashier at Macy's during my college days. I just clocked out of my shift during the holiday season. Some random person came up to me and gave me a gift card with a $50 bill wrapped around it and told me to give it to a manager or the lost and found. I was making $9.25 during that time. So of course my broke college ass took the cash. I took the $50 cash and gave the gift card to a manager as soon as I walked out of the store. Loss prevention caught me. I literally got set up by loss prevention. Story 56. I refused to drive their delivery truck. Because it was a corporate-owned truck, you had to be listed as the main driver or as an alternate driver on the insurance in order to drive it. I wasn't listed on the insurance, and if I got pulled over or happened to be involved in an accident, I would technically be liable. The store manager knew this, but told me to make the deliveries anyway and to just be careful, right? Be careful in a 22-foot-long box truck. I, again, refused and was told I was fired. That was probably the smartest thing 22-year-old me did, because when I went to unemployment, and unemployment verified what I said had happened, the store had to pay my unemployment of 2/3 my wages. Story 57. This was more of a offer revoked situation, but I interviewed with this company a couple times, and in my 3rd interview, they offered me a job. Verbal, no offer letter, no explanation of benefits, etc. I accepted conditionally, awaiting an offer letter. A few days passed, and I didn't see an offer. Finally, I called and got the runaround from a few people. All of a sudden, I get an email from the hiring manager telling me that they are revoking the verbal offer because I wasn't excited enough about the offer. They made it verbally. Story 58. I got sacked 3 days into a water drainage call center job. Got called into the office by my manager. So, Chris, we're letting you. Why? Well, Claire said you refused to take a call on Monday, and we're quite rude about it. As you're on probation, this just isn't the attitude we expect. I wasn't here on Monday. Oh, hold on. Leaves room. Sorry, Chris, it seems it was another Chris in the office. Seeing as you're here already and I've filled out the paperwork with your details, you can probably just go. Being 17 at the time, I just got up and left. Googled them after writing this. They went bust about 10 years ago. Story 59. I got fired for not showing up for work on a day I wasn't on the schedule. I had 3 days off, and my manager changed the schedule while I was off. She scheduled me to work on what would have been my 3rd day off, without telling me. When I came back, I was escorted to HR and written up for failing to show up for my shift without notifying management. When I complained, they told me it was my job to keep up with schedule changes. I told them that was B's, and they fired me. Story 60. I got fired because someone told the owner I was a filthy liberal. I got a $500 sales bonus at 9 a.m. and was fired at 1 p.m. when I came back from lunch. That being said, the owner lost his business about 6 months later when he posted a bunch of racist crap on Facebook. I am satisfied with the outcome. Story 61. Not sure if it's dumb or unreasonable, but I lost my job for being off sick twice in 3 weeks due to what turned out to be pregnancy. Only had been there a month, mind. Story 62. Worked BJ's Brewhouse. Years ago, I was fired while I was on an approved trip for my mom's aunt's funeral. I went to check my schedule for when I got back and I couldn't log in. So I called my manager and he told me, "Oh, you've been let go. We really need employees who show up for their shifts." I said, sir, how would I have been gone for a week already had I not gotten approval for this leave? RJ, if you see this, no one's ever told you how similar you actually look to Bruce Willis. Because you're short and mean. Story 63. I discovered and used a JavaScript vulnerability to bypass a state-mandated online ethics exam. They said I hacked into state resources. In my defense, the exam was buggy, and I had to have it completed by end of day. I promptly notified the exam vendor and my managers. This was a call center where I had developed a tool to automate ticket creation. Unsurprisingly, they didn't want to purchase a license for my software, and they went out of business shortly after. Fun story when potential employers ask if I've ever been fired. Story 64. I asked my general manager if I could take home a broken small stool that she asked me to throw away, and she said, "Sure, go ahead." 2 weeks later, I was escorted to the office. HR and the general manager said, "Corporate said they saw you on the camera. Take a stool from the company." I said, "Yes, the stool." Asked the general manager, for which was trash, and you said I could take it. HR said, "We don't want to do this. Everyone here likes you. But unfortunately, our hands are tied. Corporate said to let you go." And to top it off, my unemployment was denied. Story 65. I worked at a Christian church as a secretary. One day, a member asked me why I worked at the church but never went to church. I told her didn't go to church. The next day, I was accused of stealing petty cash. I had the key to the safe and a copy of the bookkeeping. When I showed the pastor, he just rolled his eyes and told me to leave. Story 66. Dumbest reason on my end. I drank on the job. It was the most cushiest do-nothing get paid, the highest pay on the payroll position. Had only 2 people above me and over 100 below me. Threw it all away because of my addiction. Treat alcohol addiction seriously the moment you sense something, folks. I'm clean now almost 2 years, but never was able to achieve that level of pay again. I'm trying though. Story 67. I was fired for not keeping up with everyone else. At the time, we were loading stuff onto pallets and moving it to another location. I was loading half as many pallets as everyone else, but they're working in teams of 2 while I'm on my own, and I'm being efficient and loading twice as much product on the pallets as they did. The guy got his karma. He wasn't allowed to fire people, and both the general manager and a department manager wanted me to stay on after this project. So of course, the guy who I was working with got fired. Story 68. When I was a kid, me and another guy hid in the giant fridge in a supermarket and ate loads of the desserts. It wasn't the best start of my working life. Story 69. During my end of probation review, I called it a job. I was then told because it was treating it like a job, and I didn't make good small talk with the customers on quiet shifts, but I was really good on the busy shifts. They said they wouldn't be keeping me on afterwards. Bearing in mind this was a part-time position in a small pub, making minimum wage, which was a lower amount. Then everyone else's cause, I wasn't 21 yet, and I was at uni at the time. Story 70, I worked at a beer distributor for a few months. I was fired because someone else sold beer to an underage girl. I wasn't even working the day it happened. They told me that because of the huge fines they had to pay, they couldn't afford to keep me on. Story 71, I requested time off for my SAT, standardized high school exam in the US, and the request was denied. When I talked to my manager and explained I needed the time for school-related stuff, she told me I needed to consider my priorities. Apparently, I should value a part-time job at a grocery store over my education. Needless to say, I told her I had considered my priorities and that she'd need to find someone else to cover that shift, as well as the rest I had scheduled. Story 72. I had a job at a nursery that had a pet department. I worked in the pet department. I got fired because I spent too much time caring for the animals. Animals were literally just product to be sold to people as far as the management was concerned. Story 73. Because I told management they needed more staff in a daycare, because they left the 5 infants in a room all day and neglected them. Worst manager in the world. I reported it to a state agency, don't know what came of it. Story 74. Over legal capacity in the 2-yo room. Made a comment about how I can't handle 20 toddlers on my own, and it was technically illegal. They told me to pack my things and go. Said I was a danger to the kids because I was unwilling to care for them. I was 19, 20 at the time. Cried a little bit because I had never been fired before, but ultimately, it was the best thing. That place sucked, and the sickness that spreads at a daycare is uncanny. Story 75. Applied to a job at a large company in an English-speaking location. They decide at the last minute to send me to a French-speaking location. Told them I don't speak French. They tell me it won't be a problem, and if it is, they will just send me to the original location. It is a problem. Got fired after 6 months for not being a team player. They made sure to make it clear it was not because I didn't speak French. Pretty sure it was. Story 76. I got fired from a gas station job after 2 weeks for stealing $10. I didn't steal anything. I talked to the district manager and told him very sincerely that I never steal. It is simply not part of who I am. He believed me and set up a sting on the station manager. They caught him red-handed. A month after I was fired, he called me to give me my job back, but I had already started another job. This was 40 years ago. Story 77. I wasn't fired for it, but in an interview, the manager asked, "What is your religion?" And I replied, "What does it matter? I mean, it hasn't anything to do with the job." He replied, "Well then, the interest is yours," and later said, "This interview isn't going well. I think we're done." Story 78. I was fired on my first day because my bra strap accidentally popped out. It was a job I had to do manual labor. I had just crawled on the floor to unscrew a heavy set of chairs and then carried the chairs with the help of 2 other people for a very long distance. So in that ensuing crawling, lifting, moving, one of my bra straps popped out, and they said I violated the dress code and let me go. I am still livid. Story 79. I was managing incompleted and completed jobs by entering in the data in our computer. The uncompleted jobs had CC info, rather than throwing them into one bin and disposing of it properly. They gave me a shredder and a trash can. The boss yelled at me for using the shredder, so they gave me a black highlighter. After processing hundreds of jobs, one was found to have CC in the trash and they fired me for this. Story 80. I was working a temp job with the owner of the company and his son doing some landscaping. While I was shoveling out a retaining wall, the owner's son just sat there and talked with me, not doing much. Apparently, I wasn't working hard enough for the both of us, and he fired me on the spot. Still the only job I've been fired from 20 plus years later. Story 81. First job ever, and it was Christmas shifts at McDonald's. I spent 8 hours a day, 4 days a week. Was at Collage, so balancing had some issues. Making burgers and yelling cheese on 8. After 4 weeks, the manager asked me to come into their office and gave me the bad news that they had to let me go because, quote, "You're not having enough fun." Story 82. I worked at Waffle House for 1 day back when I was 19. They hired me on as a cook. I told them I can't cook. They said, "That's okay, we'll teach you." They did not teach me. I was fired 2 hours into my shift and they refused to pay me. I am now 27 and that's the crappiest job I've ever worked. Story 83. 1. Didn't let a dude suck my junk. Publicly shamed my boss for violating federal law. Pointed out that our manager forces us to commit fraud on a weekly basis, and we don't know if she's stealing from us. 4. I had a job and they didn't want there to be any scheduling conflicts. One job ends at 2 and the restaurant that fired me opens at 4. They couldn't possibly ever conflict. Story 84. I worked at a Quickie Mart type place. An old man came in with his legs crossed, pleading with me to use the restroom. I let him, this was not allowed, and as soon as he finishes, our area manager showed up unannounced. I was fired for letting someone use the restroom. Story 85. I was a delivery driver in college. I got fired because my car broke down, and I needed 3 days off before it would be fixed, so they fired me because it was pushing my workload onto the team. I literally don't think they could even hire a new driver that quickly. Story 86. On my 4th week, a trainer didn't like that I was insisting we do things the right way. He wanted to keep talking on his cell and was using hand gestures from 300 feet away instead of our radios. He told the boss I was using racial slurs and got me fired. Story 87. I worked for a call center while I was in high school and they scheduled me for a 6 a.m. shift on a weekday, then fired me for obviously being unable to work. During those hours, Story 80, a HR lady didn't like that. I said it's illegal for an employer to prevent employees from discussing pay between each other. She knew I was right and fired me a few weeks later for poor performance, even though I was still in training. Story 89. I was a bartender. I was the only male bartender. I would be alone working the whole bar by myself and have to check kegs and switch them at the end of the night. This is at the end of every week. Saturday, Sunday. Till this day, I believe the manager just wanted women to drink with him in his office. Only women bartend there. Story 90. I offered to work extra hours off the clock without pay around the holidays when we were short-handed because I felt bad for my overwhelmed coworkers. Apparently that was taken as subverting the manager, and I was fired. Their loss. Story 91. I pointed out a flaw in a new product. I told everyone, if we don't put at least one vented, it could blow up and kill somebody. Got everything taken from me 2 days later by a coworker, as none of the higher-ups wanted to do it. Now that company is in a massive lawsuit for the very flaw I pointed out. Story 92. Off for a few months with a bad throat infection. Once it was better, occupational therapists said it was a requirement to have phased return, where I work a few hours each day for coming in full-time and risking my health again. Boss saw this, said nope, and fired me because they don't do phased return. Story 93. Reported a security issue to the wrong folks. Got fired and they kept paying me for 5 months on my limited 6-month contract as a student, which also could not be extended. Was like winning the lottery for me back then. Story 94. Worked for a small 20-person company. CEO's wife was flirting with me at our first team dinner out together. I did nothing, avoided her. She was making comments in front of him like, "Oh, who's the handsome new joiner?" and touching my arm. Next week, I got fired with no notice and no reason given, despite doing really well. Was totally unfair. Story 95. Called in sick at 6 a.m. once. Was seriously sick, didn't do morning job either. And was fired exactly when I would have started in this Gitz warehouse as normal. Said he didn't believe I was ill. Have never been fired, barring this. 32 years. Working. Story 96. Failure to meet performance goals. Doesn't seem dumb, but the trick is I didn't have performance goals. At all. None. I even asked how much work I should get done in an average week multiple times, and every time, including when he fired me, my boss just said, it just kind of depends. Story 97. I swore at some Karen that bit me on the leg. FYI, that Karen was a coworker's dog who they brought into the studio as they rented a desk. 10 years at the company, I was also the last employee. Been unemployed for a year now. Good times. Story 98. I had a manager fire me because I went over his head to quit directly with his boss, who I was on much better terms with. Joke was on him though, firing me, let me collect unemployment while I was waiting for my other job that I'd already accepted to start. Story 99. 2 employees were vaping in the kitchen while I was doing dishes about 10 feet away. I was called on my day off and fired for not snitching on them. What's the dumbest thing you've been fired for? Story 1. I got fired once for having emergency gallbladder surgery. We had a phone deposition with HR and the unemployment judge. After they explained when I was fired, the judge asked them why they didn't offer me FMLA. They said, he didn't ask. The judge said, it's your job to offer him FMLA. You're lucky that he didn't sue you. Unemployment approved. Story 2. I got fired for reporting the daycare I worked at to the state for blatant violations and providing photo evidence. That facility got shut down shortly after. Story 3. I got fired for quitting once. I worked in a shop that modified laptops. People wanted the latest Asus laptops, but with special thermal paste or a faster processor or whatever. And so we'd swap parts out and do whatever the customer asked and then put it all back together. This was an okay gig for me. It wasn't in my wheelhouse, but it was different from the crap jobs I'd taken before. And so I stuck with it for as long as I could. Until one day, there was a particularly tricky modification required of one laptop. Tricky enough that 3 different people, including myself, ended up doing different things to the laptop. Typically, if there was some kind of mod needed that only the owner was comfortable doing, they were the only one to handle the whole computer. So for 3 people to duck with one lappy was weird. Somehow in the kerfuffle of passing the thing around the office, the i9 went missing. Instantly, the blame falls entirely to me. I scour my workstation and tear everything apart. The chip isn't there. I try to point out that 3 ducking people touched the thing, but the owner insisted they didn't lose it, and the other guy had been working there too long to make that kind of mistake. A couple of days go by, and a friend of mine that works there tells me the higher-ups think I stole the chip to resell it. They then tell me that the owner's actually a reasonable person. And if I just go in and talk about how 3 people, including them, handled the machine, likely they would just split the cost of the missing processor 3 ways and consider it done. When I go back in, I overhear the boss and the other employee that modded the laptop talking about how they don't tolerate this kind of incompetence, and something has to be done, etc. I knock on the office door and ask to talk about the situation. Even though the boss has already just sat around flapping gums about me, he doesn't have time right now. I wait until lunch and go try his office again. He's again in his office, again just so happening to be discussing incompetence and theft in the office with the same employee who is nodding their head in agreement. The boss still doesn't have time to talk to me. When I leave for lunch, I don't go back. I call my previous employer and ask for my job back. They're happy to have me. I stay home, confident in my decision. A couple hours later, I get a call from my secretly ex-boss. They want to know why I'm late. I tell them I got my old job back and don't appreciate all this avoidance and accusation without even talking to me, just about me. They go, "You realize what you just did, right? You walked on a job. You're fired." They said themselves. "You walked, so you're fired." Whatever, I say. I'll come get my last paycheck next Monday. I get my check without incident and resume my previous gig as a taxi driver. The cost of the processor was not deducted from my check. Story 4. I took a coffee mug home from the office kitchen on a Friday, got a call from HR on Saturday asking me to come in for an emergency meeting, and was fired on the spot. Turns out I was seen by security walking out with company property, the coffee mug from the office kitchen. Later, I was able to prove it was my personal mug and was offered my job back, but I declined to return. Story 5. I've only been fired from one job, the one I worked at for 12 and a half years. Aunt and uncle ran an automotive shop. Cousin trained me, he left, and for years, I was the only mechanic in the back. After 4 to 5 years, we got 2 other mechanics in the back. I met a girl, got married, ended up asking if I could get insurance. Uncle blew up at me for it, ended the discussion with, "You'd stupid ass isn't holding me hostage over this bullcrap." My aunt would say the same thing she always said when she was mad. She would call my aunt half Mexican piece of crap and call me by my full birth name, instead of using the last name V had, since my stepdad adopted us and married my mom when I was 7. I went a town over to get a part from the Ford dealership and asked if they needed techs. They had heard of me, and I was hired on the spot. I went back and gave my uncle the news and a full month's notice. He pulled me into his office that Friday and said he thought I was stealing from the shop. I remember having the immediate response of, "I'm not, and you can check the security cameras and prove it." I also remember his response, "No, it's easier this way." I was in shock, and after being told that I went to get a trailer to load my box. Uncle broke into my box and stole a few grand worth of Snap-on and other brand tools. When I asked about it, he said, "You can't prove anything." I loaded my box, said my goodbyes to the other 2 techs who had come aboard. I remember Randall looking like he was going to cry. I went to leave, and my uncle tried to shake my hand and said, "Hey, don't let family hold you back." I looked at him, said, "For the first time, I'm not," and left without shaking his hand. I was worried it was going to be terrible, things wouldn't work out, or it was going to suck. Holy ducking hell, was I wrong. This new job has its frustrations, but it's a million times better. I thought it was funny. I got a vehicle he tossed an engine in, had electrical issues. Turns out he thought it needed a BCM, but he had about half a dozen connectors in wrong spots. When he came to pick it up, he asked my coworker, "Does that kid still work here?" And my coworker responded with, "Yeah, we call him the Brujo, because he fixes the ones no one else can." Story 6. While working in the produce section of a grocery store in Iowa, someone heard me talking about stocking cherries, which in their mind was stalking cherries, virgin. And the next thing I knew, me and the produce manager were outside, and he offered me a ride home because my parents were working. I walked home and randomly someone threw a McDonald's cheeseburger at me and hit me in the back of my leg. Weird day. Story 7. Was working at a plastic bag making factory, or whatever it's called. But when I started working there, the guy training me was amazing. He taught me everything he knew and made sure to teach me everything to the letter. Great guy. A few months later, I'm told he's leaving and I'm taking his position. All right, thank you so much. Everything you taught me. Years later, he comes back but takes the office position. I got up to the manager and tell her that I'm fine. If he wants his old position back, she says it's fine. He didn't ask for it, so everything's good. I got up to him and tell him the same, and he tells me the same thing. Okay, well, if you ever change your mind, just let me know. I really don't have any issues giving you your old position. A couple months later, I'm doing my job, sorting some pallets outside, and by the loading dock, there was a small blackberry tree that I've been taking care of because why not? And it's finally growing some. He joins me and asks me if he can ride the forklift for old time's sake. Sure, have at it. Later on, he comes back and tells me to help him take down that tree, and I was like, why? It's not on the way and it's not bothering no one? Yeah, but that's what the boss lady said. But okay, fine. At the end of my shift, I get called to the office and get written up for insubordination for not doing what he had asked me to do. WTF. Whatever, sure. I just asked why, but whatever it is, what it is. I got up to him before I left and I apologized and told him I didn't know that that's how he felt and that I just do what I'm told. After all, he was just following orders. The next day when I come in, I get called to the office and the manager tells me she's firing me for threatening him and cussing him out and whatnot. I was very surprised and I asked if they could bring him up and they said no and to leave immediately before they called the cops on me. Edit. Literally a day after I got fired, a friend from that place told me they immediately put him in my position. Story 8. I was working in electronics at Walmart. There was an actual rule that you could not check out family member, but the unspoken rule was that if you knew someone well enough to know their first name, You weren't allowed to check them through your line. I was working the day after Black Friday. I had a line going out the back of the department. I was the only damned cashier in electronics. A friend of my mother's was apparently in my line. I had already started scanning items when I looked up and realized it was someone I knew. She didn't even have any freaking electronics. I went ahead and checked her through. A coworker reported to management that I had checked my mother through my line. They were both overweight, same age, similar haircuts, glasses. I understand the mistake as I hadn't been working there very long. Even when I explained to management who it actually was, they said I should have stopped and called a manager to come cancel the transaction and walk her to the front of the store to be checked out by someone else. So because I checked someone I knew in passing through my line, instead of waiting for a freaking manager during the Black Saturday rush and holding up my line for as much as 10-15 minutes, I got fired on the spot. Story 9. I got hired right out of college to work as a manager of a new locally owned pet store. The guy was just starting it and wanted to build a brand and expand and stuff. I felt like I probably shouldn't have been hired in the first place. I felt like he was hiring me on vibe alone since I was very young and had no experience doing anything. He hired about 3 cashiers as well, and one by one, he fired them. The first one for no showing, I thought that was legit. She tried to get unemployment, and I remember talking to whoever you talked to about that, saying, no, we couldn't get a hold of her for 3 days, and then we stopped trying. She wouldn't answer her phone, and she didn't come in for any of her shifts for 2 weeks. I'm pretty sure she's not eligible for unemployment. Then he fired the remaining ones for increasingly ridiculous reasons. The second one he fired because he wasn't enthusiastic enough while he was working there or something. And the third one he fired for some bullcrap reason I can't remember. I figured I was next. I was struggling. I'd be like, we've needed filing cabinets for a while. And he'd be like, well, you should have bought them and then invoiced me to reimburse you. And I was thinking to myself, I don't know who you think I am, but I'm a 22-year-old who is 3,000 miles from friends and family. Living paycheck to paycheck with my boyfriend, I moved out here with... What money was I going to buy filing cabinets with? When I was eventually fired, I decided it was inevitable because I didn't fit in with his fantasy of what a pet store manager should do, or what I personally could do. I visited the place recently for the first time in like 16 years, and it is completely different. Different business model, no expansion, but it is still there though. The guy apparently has nothing to do with it though. I think his wife was like, dude, you don't know what you're doing, and took over. I wonder how many people he fired before that happened. Story 10. I worked in logistics. We were the overnight crew who basically took care of all the backorder stuff, and oopsies, where did the shipping label come from? Should I have already shipped to that out problems and stuff? Basically, the day shift dropped all their whatever the duck this is crap on us, and it was our duty to figure it out. There were 3 other young women besides myself. Our boss was a young gentleman. Every weekend they would go out drinking and partying together. I politely declined. After a couple of months of this, my boss approached me directly and pretty much tried to strong-arm me into going and try to belittle me and degrade me for wanting to just go home after work. Long story short, I found out all 3 of the other women weren't just partying with him. They were ducking him, and he wanted me to do the same. I refused and left quickly. I did not yell at him or anything else. I was going to report him in the morning, but HR wasn't open at the time I got a call at 8 a.m. that morning. Our shift tended to end between 3 o'clock a.m. and 4 o'clock a.m., saying that my services were no longer needed and not to bother coming in anymore. Story 11. Not really fired because it wasn't a job, but an unpaid internship. My degree field requires a certain amount of clinical hours in order to graduate. So I got this internship at a place that was literally a couple of blocks away from my house. I had only been there for a week, so I was still learning everything, and my supervisor told me to come in for a mandatory training for a new computer system that this place was using. On the day of the training, I slept through my alarm and woke up 10 minutes after the training was supposed to start. I texted my supervisor, apologizing and saying that my alarm didn't wake me. I told her that I would still come in and that it wouldn't take too long for me to get there, since I lived so close. She texted me back saying, don't bother. By the time you get here, you won't be able to get caught up with the training, and I can't fill you in on what you missed. I asked if I could make it up some other day, and she was like, no, the next training won't be for a while. I felt genuinely terrible. The next day, I got an email from my advisor telling me that my internship was being discontinued. My supervisor said that she was disappointed because not only did I miss the training, but on the first day, when she handed me the manual, I just flipped through it for a few minutes before going back to playing around on the phone. And because I worked on a paper for one of my classes while on the way back from a road trip that we took, she said that she expected better from a student of my caliber. TBH, I should have took it as a red flag, when on my first day there, she told me that she had fired her previous intern. It seemed like her expectations were way too high for someone doing what is essentially unpaid labor. It all worked out in the end though, because later on, I ended up getting an even better internship with a wonderful supervisor who genuinely cared about seeing me succeed. Story 12. I was training to be a 911 operator in a very large metro area. I, with my trainer listening in, received a 911 call around 3 a.m. from a woman, maybe 45 to 50 years old, crying because her boyfriend hit her so hard that some of her teeth came out. I asked her things like if she was safe now, did the BF have any weapons, and where she wanted to meet with the officers. In the duration of the 45-60 seconds of asking her those questions, she decided that she didn't want to go through with the process. Common in DV victims upset cops will just upset their abuser more. I offered to arrange to have her meet the officers down the block. This is when my trainer started getting visibly angry. I continued with the woman who was contemplating my proposal. I said he shouldn't be hitting her, and that having the officers come talk with her would at least provide her some option. She said she'd think about it. And before we hung up, I reminded her that we're always here to help everyone in the community, and she can call back anytime. She thanked me and hung up to me. My trainer was furious. She said she didn't want help. You should have hung up on her right at that moment. I was let go for underperformance, because all our agency cares about is keeping call times under 3 minutes. That was probably a 4-minute phone call. I was given the opportunity to quit my job after they went back and readjusted all my training assessment values to ensure that I wouldn't pass, even if I aced every upcoming trial. I was the only trainee in my group of 6 to get 100% on both tests 1 and 2. In my resignation letter, I noted that this job does not meet my definition of helping people and wish the people of the community good luck. Story 13. Got fired for being a no-show, no-call. The manager lied and said I never contacted her and was shaking like a leaf. Went to the owner and said, "Here's my outgoing call to get the day before, saying I had the fever and chills, etc." It was my phone record showing I called the manager's number and a 90-second call. 2 weeks later, they confirmed that wasn't the only thing she was lying about, embezzlement, and they offered me my manager's job. I said only if they gave me her rate and benefits. They said they couldn't do that, and I wouldn't budge. I drove back to the business and shook hands, and they were apologetic, but I hated that job anyway. Story 14, kinda long. This was a temp job at a factory that prints logos on mugs, glasses, etc. Keith, the supervisor, has everyone sit at a series of tables first thing in the morning. There are piles of boxes with pint glasses. Our job was to open the boxes, remove each glass, which were in plastic bags, discard the bags, and return the glasses to the box, then tape it back up. It's tedious. I hate tedium and always seek efficiency. After a few seconds of thought, I decided to flip the box over and open it from the bottom. Now I could grab all the bags with 2 hands, 1 pull, and not remove a single glass from the box. After about 5 minutes, I was done with my pile and asked others if they needed help or wanted to try my way. They seemed scared at the notion and refused. The place was a pigsty, garbage everywhere. That cardboard fluffy dust piled a foot high in the corners, etc. So I grabbed a broom and cleaned everything. The next step in the process was to go to the conveyor room where we were to unload the boxes of glass onto a conveyor where it went into the print area. As soon as Keith got everyone situated, he pulled me aside, walked me to the time clock, and clocked me out. He said I wasn't a good fit and I was done there. When I got home, I had a message on my answering machine from the temp service to call back immediately. I called and she said I was no longer able to work for them because I was fired for insubordination, and that was grounds for termination of services. I explained what happened, and she opened up and spilled that that place had their highest turnover rate. Of any of their customers, she'd file inquiry and hold off on my termination of service. Story 15. My hair. I'm a white woman with very curly, big, blonde, natural hair. I straightened it for the interview. First day of work, I showed up with my natural hair. I understand that this can be considered a bait and switch to some, but please remember that straightening my hair every day is very damaging. The owner and lawyer I was working with instantly grimaced at my hair and commented on it, telling me to get it under control. The next day, I put it in a bun and pinned it back. I showed up to work and she gave a look of disgust at my hair and told me it was fine. Then, the next morning, I was fired. I can only ascertain the reason. Story 16. Some father believed that I was whispering in his 3-year-old's ear to cuss, or allowing the other kids I was babysitting to whisper in his daughter's ear to convince her to have a potty mouth, while he swore up and down that he absolutely did not cuss around his daughter, and that the only time he cussed when she was at his house was when he was playing video games with his headset while she was in bed sleeping. She was the lightest sleeper I had ever cared for. Meanwhile, Mom had had custody of her since before summer, so I hadn't even had his daughter in months. Only babysat her when Dad had custody. And the week she came back to me, she was cussing like a sailor. Already seemed to be a habit. I had been watching her for years, so it broke my heart. I had never had a parent remove their child from my care before. I suppose it was the straw that broke the camel's back because Dad was also annoyed with me for not having her potty trained even though supposedly she was fully trained at his house. He kept her on the pot 24/7, but at my house she refused because she was worried about the other kids playing with and taking away her toys. We would sit on the potty for half an hour before nap time, but she would hold it until I laid her down for a nap, and he thought I was slacking and not really trying. But as soon as I would lay her down and leave the room to go clean up after lunch, she was trying to have a bowel movement. If I noticed what she was doing, I would take her to the toilet, but she would scream bloody murder and disturb the other kids' naps. Story 17, remember when Dwayne Wade won the finals versus the Mavs way back in the day single-handedly? Yeah, I was watching in the men's room the whole game, and yup, got fired at it. Worth it, sorry, yeah. Story 18, not technically fired. I was an IT contractor for a while. The client firm decided to make some contractors permanent. I was one of 2 on my team. Only one was going to get the job. The other would not have their contract renewed. I was the better engineer. He was the better socializer. He got the job, ETA. It's not like I was some a hole that no one liked. My colleague was a smoker, but I'm not. A number of long-time existing permanent staff were also smokers, so they all had more face time with each other, and it was more casual. Also, I'm not nearly as bitter about this as it may sound. It was disappointing at the time, and led to some rough times for a bit. But now I'm doing much better professionally than I probably would be if I was still there. Story 19. I have 2 worked at Panera when I was 16 and was being harassed by one of my coworkers who was in his 40s and knew my age. I reported him to the manager, who didn't do anything despite camera footage showing him harassing me. So I went to HR and found out my coworker's mom was the head of HR, so she covered it up. And I never showed up on the schedule again. IDK if I was actually fired though, because they never said anything to me. A few months after Panera, I was working at Sonic and called in saying I was sick, but they still made me come in. So while I was on shift, I carried around a cup so I could puke. Eventually, the cup got full, so I went to throw it away, and the manager that was working with me assumed it was a drink I messed up and got mad at me for wasting it, and gave it to the customer before I could say anything. The customer took a sip of my vomit and immediately made a face and threw it back into the window. When I told my manager what was in the cup, he didn't want to admit that he was wrong and promptly fired me for showing up sick on the job, even though he was the one who said I wouldn't get to pick my shifts if I didn't show up. I was a student athlete at the time, so I needed to be able to go to work without it affecting practice. Anyways, I made this on a burner, so it wouldn't get back to me. Story 20. Casino, about 15 years ago, refused to arrest a young adult accompanying his mother and allowed him use of the restroom. Boss, that was a former cop, got into a heated disagreement. The young adult was arguing about his cutoff and had a valid point that he wasn't driving. Due to the fact we bussed him in from out of the area, they could not reasonably kick him off property. He was told to sit outside and wait in the cold winter air with only a light jacket and no ability to use a restroom. I tried negotiating with boss, offered to escort to an outside bathroom, tried getting busy driver to let him use that one, tried getting a cab to take him. Bridge crossing to fast food joints was missing a guardrail due to construction and wasn't a safe option. I had a decision to make and let him enter after holding his ID and screening him. I warned him to be quick. He made it out about 2 minutes before they showed up to arrest him. Dispatch had been waiting to give the signal. I got fired for insubordination and was told I should have kicked it up to the manager on duty, which ironically is going outside the chain of command and still insubordination. No regrets. I have to live with myself, and I never made an arrest I was ashamed or embarrassed about. I had to fight and won my unemployment. Story 21. I was fired for not being available after hours as an hourly employee. Was never allowed to take my laptop home during Ramadan. A client experienced an outage, and I was the only one in the area while the boss and family were out camping. I filed a case with the Department of Labor, Story 22. There was this form that my manager had to fill out every day at noon. Only managers were allowed to retrieve, print, and fill out the form. She was in the security office crying one day and couldn't do it, so she made me jump through all these hoops to get it done by noon by asking every single manager to do a separate part of the task. She was crying for hours. Boyfriend thing, The form wasn't that big of a deal, but was standard procedure and could have gotten us into minor trouble if the right person came in for an audit that day at that exact time. Anyway, a few weeks later, she's in the office crying for hours again. I kept calling her to get the form done, but she wouldn't respond. I guess she just assumed that I'd jump through all of those hoops again. The problem was that I had no idea what file to ask a manager to open. Where the executive printer was, none of it. It was too many random steps that I'd have to ask too many people to do in pieces, and I had only done it once. Anyway, I couldn't get it done that day, and another manager pulled me into the office a few days later, interrogated me about the form and why I didn't do it, said he wasn't aware that Megan was crying for the entire shift, fired me anyway. Story 23. I was fired for going on break. Evidently, being scheduled for a break isn't enough. You have to be dismissed for break. I just up and left. I was 18 years old working as a bagger at a grocery store. My logic was that I was scheduled for that break and don't think I needed to be told to clean the restrooms when I was scheduled to do so I shouldn't have to be told to go on break. My bosses disagreed. When I was 29, I was fired for having a job interview somewhere else. I requested the time off, and although I could have lied and said doctor's appointment or dental appointment, I thought it was best to show that I had integrity and tell my boss the truth. However, he and I didn't get along at all, and as soon as I put my lunch in my locker the next day, he came to me and fired me. I tried to get my lunch out, and he told me that I wasn't allowed back in the building. So, yeah, I lost my personal padlock to that company. I also accidentally put my milk in my locker and was going to put it into the company fridge when he intercepted me, fired me, and denied me the ability to go back into the factory. So I didn't care about the milk in my locker. Pretty sure that was a wonderful smell to return to on Monday for everyone. Story 24. I was poached by a rival company to help them purchase new machinery, install said machinery, develop relevant training and safety programs, and then I was to slide into a supervisory role where I'd focus on process improvement. Spent months basically revamping their entire operation, literally from the ground up. 2 weeks from Christmas, I informed the owner that I've effectively finished all the initial phases of my employment, and that after the holiday break, I'd be able to slide into the supervisor role. He was pleasantly surprised that I'd finished so early and had me present to him an overview of everything I'd done. I come in the next day and he fired me for time theft because I'd gone and bought 2 pizzas for the guys a week prior. I found out later from another supervisor that he bragged about having planned on letting me go all along. But the best part was that the company folded entirely last year. Turns out that even though I had trained everyone on the machinery, nobody knew how to fix it once it broke down aside from me and people that actively worked for the company I came from. And nobody was jumping ship after hearing what happened to me. They ended up basically on life support 3 months after my departure, and had to go back to the remaining machinery that they had warehoused but hadn't yet scrapped out. Story 25. I've got 3. One was that I didn't want to be friends with the new boss and hang out outside of work with her and my coworkers. Apparently, I wasn't enough of a team player, and it brought down morale for her. I was well liked by the rest of the staff and would have and did hang out with them outside work. I just disliked the boss. The other was when I was a newer employee at a company and got sick with the flu. I used sick time and was out for a week. That Monday, they enacted a new attendance policy. By being out for the week, even though I had accrued and was using all my sick time, I violated it. I was talked to by AR, who understood that I was not there to be briefed or anything about the new attendance policy since I started after the company-wide briefing and was out when it started. I was fired that Friday for violating the new attendance policy. The most recent one was back in June. Your benefits kick in at day 90 of employment. Me and 44 other people were laid off on which day? You guessed it, day 89. I saw the job posting back up on Indeed later that week with a 3-hour decrease in starting pay. Story 26. Being 15 minutes late because I got a flat tire on my way to work. It was the shift after I had just gotten a final warning for attendance, but why I was on the final was so stupid. I had put in for a vacation months in advance and made reservations for hotels and booked plane tickets for a trip to Disney World. Anyway, I go on vacation and all is great, but then on Monday my work blew up my phone trying to find out where I was. They had me put down as a no call, no show. It was October, and I put in for the vacation in May. I had asked my supervisor if my vacation was approved, and she told me it was. Well, apparently there was a clerical error, and HR got to put it in the system. They wanted me to come back immediately, and I told them it's not possible. I eventually get back and get dragged into HR with my supervisor and get put on a final warning for attendance. I had oil write-ups in my 6 years there. Rather than make a big deal about it, I just signed the paper because I figure I have perfect attendance anyway, and this will just go away in 6 months. But then, yeah, next day, flat tire, and I get axed. Story 27. I worked at a coffee shop around Christmas. I asked the boss if I could pick up a couple of half-gallons of eggnog on my milk run and make some eggnog lattes because customers were requesting them. I bought some, cut it 50-50 with whole milk, and steamed it up. We sold out of both of them in about half an hour after I put up a special of the day sign on the register. I asked the boss if I could go and buy another 6 half-gallons. She said yes. I brought 6 more back. I went through 3 more of them. Before my boss noticed, I bought regular eggnog. And she flipped out because the one I made for her husband ended up in her hands and she drank it, loved it. Then she realized I made it with regular eggnog. She was an anorexic 90-year-old woman who opened the cafe for a hobby because her husband was worth tens of millions of dollars and wanted something to do. The cafe went out of business 6 months later, and the interview with the owner in the press said that rent was too high. Pete's took over the location a year or so after that, and it's been over at Pete's ever since, probably 20 plus years. Story 28. Back when I was in my teens, I got a job working for a supermarket in their bakery department. I was going on break and decided to get myself a treat and asked the manager to ring me up, and he said, "It's on me, don't worry about it." I said cool and went upstairs to the McDonald's area to enjoy my strawberry cheesecake ice cream in a cup with a sugar cone on top. After my break, I went back downstairs where the head manager was waiting for me and said I was fired for stealing ice cream. I tried to explain my side of the story, but she wouldn't listen. I was fired for ice cream because my manager told me that I didn't have to pay, even though I had every intention of paying. To this day, I believe there was a conspiracy to get me out and that I was set up by Heather and her cronies. Never trust any coworker or manager and always pay for ice cream. Story 29. I'm pretty sure I was fired as a witness to spousal abuse. I was groundskeeping for a wealthy local business owner. Not so local, really. I think the products are available nationwide in every box store. Anyhow, one day I was outside sweeping Buckeyes from the driveway when the husband came screeching into the driveway. He drove a Mercedes compressor sedan, stormed inside, started yelling and screaming, slamming doors and cabinets. There was a muffled argument, then silence. And a while later, the wife came outside, crying with a paycheck, and told me I was being let go. It was a cash gig, so there wasn't any recourse. But I'm pretty sure that's what happened. Story 30. The only time I've ever been fired, I was only technically fired. Basically, Walmart treated me like crap when I worked there. Problems with the local management. So when I quit, I didn't bother telling them. I just stopped showing up. The dumbest reason I've seen anyone fired was for being gay. There's a bit more nuance here. He had an employee evaluation that was completely glowing, highest ratings on everything except for a comment at the bottom that he needed to quit flaunting his sexuality. To be clear, this guy never flaunted his sexuality other than just having the kind of fruity personality that everyone else knew he was gay before he figured it out himself. He complained to HR, the supervisor got in trouble, and the next day he was fired. For the record, yes, he sued and yes, he won. He didn't get or want his job back, but he did get something like 2 years worth of his salary, plus his legal fees covered, so, a win. Edit, another good one I just thought of. I knew a kid who got fired from Subway for getting punched. Seriously, he didn't fight back. He just got socked in the face by a coworker and went down and they both got fired. Story 31. Was planning to go straight from work to camping on a Friday, so I had my truck all packed up. Boss saw my sealed bottle of whiskey in the front seat and canned me over it for having alcohol at work. He had a grudge for some reason. Story 32. Asking one of the owners if they need help deep cleaning the restaurant because it was getting pretty bad and suggesting I don't mind to come in at 5 a.m. to come in and help. They ended up taking me off the schedule on the busiest night they ever had, at the time when they had a live band come play for the first time, and I had coworkers begging me to come in and fill my empty shift. When I show up, the owner who took me off the schedule said to me, "If you get through tonight, you and me, we're cool." I never worked there again, but I kept seeing him in the local bar and music scene, and he was really awkward for a while because he knew he screwed up. I easily forgave him, and we became good friends. I just knew I couldn't work under him. For what it's worth, he was drinking heavily at the time and has since gotten much better about his drinking and decision-making and is a good man. Yet to be informed by one of the managers that the reason I was let go was because I was too keen to help was bullcrap at the time. Story 33, 1979, was forced to resign my commission from the USAF as a C-141 pilot because they found out I was gay. Luckily, I had a great attorney and got an honorable discharge, and am now happily retired from Delta E and enjoying retirement with my now husband of 42 years, Story 34. I didn't wear non-slip shoes to orientation for the summer train. I worked on the winter train as a server from Anchorage to Fairbanks once a week trip. I just made Employee of the Month over the entire division of Alaska. It was a mega corps offering food service workers and janitorial roles all over the state. This Karen manager who didn't like me told me to attend orientation casual. They sent me home to change and fired me at the end of the day. How the duck I'm gonna slip in a carpeted ballroom is beyond me. Josh, you're a Karen for not being man enough to fire me yourself and had to get Tyler and Antoine to do your dirty work. Tyler, you were a total about it. And I hope your wife knows you keep a list of all your sexual encounters, including names and details that you casually show to people you creep. Antoine, you are a real one for remaining silent because you knew it was total bullcrap what they were doing to me. S is a bunch of snakes and is universally hated as a staffing company. Story 35, getting to work 6 minutes late. There was an accident on the freeway and they said that was not a valid excuse. I happily signed the paperwork and walked out with a smile. The manager asked why I was not upset, and all I said was, why should I be? You're losing your best asset. He laughed and said I was always too confident. The business went bankrupt and shut down just a few months after that. It was a coincidence because I wasn't that good of an employee, Story 36. I was too eager to prove myself. I'm a classically trained woodworker, did 3 years of shop class in high school, and a full year of college after that. Worked as a custom woodworker for a year, and a custom cabinet maker for $3. And they wanted me to wait so they could train me how to laminate boards together. Didn't even need to be flush, as they flattened them on a CNC afterwards. Story 37. Oh, I'll never forget this. Used to work at a restaurant and came back in college during summer to make some extra money. Surprised to see some new faces, but that's the industry for you. New interim manager filling in while old manager was off training while running food service expo shows. Had apparently set aside some ice cream for herself in the freezer and pulled me into the office to ask why I ate it. I obviously didn't have any idea what she was talking about and told her, so she fired me for insubordination or some such nonsense. Probably my third day back. Think I was 18 at the time. Still can't tell if she was threatened by me or what. Either way, duck that place and duck that lady. Story 38. Wasn't directly fired, but quit ahead of them giving me a disciplinary. The reason? The company specialized in care residents for young people with mental health issues. Company failed to pay rent on a property, dodged calls from the landlord, who I, as their admin, had a lot of conversations with, so lost the property due to being behind on payments. Company asked me to write a letter to all of the residents in that property, telling them the property had been lost, but blaming it on the residents, claiming it was down to their untidiness and noisiness. To me, if you're dealing with people who are struggling already with things like anxiety and depression, you do not want to be putting undue blame on them. So I refused on the grounds of it being against the company values they supposedly upheld. Registered it as a complaint via the formal process. They disobeyed that process, forwarded the concern directly to the people in question, who tried to cover it up and subsequently gave me a disciplinary for spreading misinformation in an attempt to cause a scandal. Story 39. Not telling my kids to leave me alone to work when I was stuck at home after pandemic hit. I had 3 kids, all elementary school aged at the time, and we were taking things very seriously since it was a few months in. My divorced manager of adult children, who did not live with him, he was working from home with his dogs to keep him company, told me I needed to focus on my work and ignore my kids, and if they came to the door knocking and needing me, I should just tell them to go away and that I had to do my work. At that point, I welcomed a PIP and just silent quit until they let me and a number of my coworkers go. I still don't regret my actions. Story 40. I was working in a department store. In the evenings, we were supposed to help customers clean up and prepare our department for the next morning. They hired an employee that either could not or would not do the job and was rarely seen outside of the break room. The rest of us were told to check and make sure her area of responsibility was done. If not, we were to do it. One night, I managed to completely not check one aisle in her area. A week later, I was called into the office to discuss my failure and sign a form stating that I'd been counseled that would stay in my employment file and would be removed if I did not have another incident within a 6-month period. I suggested they counsel the employee whose responsibility it was to do the job and refused to sign. They fired me within a week. 7 other employees quit without notice. Story 41, Safeway 2013, high schooler working a summer job as a courtesy clerk. I think I had food poisoning from the taco truck I stopped at while I was walking to work, and about an hour into my shift, I had to take a really heavy dump. I was probably in there for almost 10 minutes, and it truly was a bad one. Like, not just the smell, but the actual pain. Apparently, the smell had leaked out of the bathroom and made its way to the vegetable area. The bathroom was right at the doors to get into the back at a split between the raw meats and vegetables, to a point where not only were people complaining, but it was so bad that people were straight up leaving the store. Not even a minute after leaving the bathroom, I got pulled into the back and screamed at by the manager for another 10 minutes before she just said GTFO and don't come back. Story 42. In a small tennis pro shop as a summer job during college, I greeted everyone and asked if there was anything I could help with. If not, I just let them shop until and unless they asked about something. Apparently, I shouldn't have asked and should have just followed them around being a pushy salesman. This was ostensibly so obvious. I was fired for not being aggressive enough with sales without ever being told I was expected to be the worst stereotype of a salesman. And I don't think it was a cover for anything else, because I worked 3 other jobs at the same private community both before and after that, and everyone else thought I was great with the members. The pro shop was independently owned, so it was different bosses. Story 43. Called off work. 2 months in advance, got time off approved week before leaving. Reminded I'll be out of state day before I leave. Coworker asks me to cover so they can go to a A7X concert. Sorry, can't ill be in another state. They understood and went to ask others. I'm on a bus in Kansas. I know because I saw nothing but the curve of the earth in every direction. Get a phone call from work. When are you coming in? I'm on vacation, remember? So said you'd cover for them since they are sick, that, they are going to that A7X concert. Doesn't matter. They said you said you'd cover. I'm on a bus in the middle of Kansas. But TF, do you want me to do? Bring your uniform in when you get back. Gladly. Ice snowboarding, so that in Colorado on that trip, story 44, was in training to be an assistant manager at a major convenience store chain. It was the middle of winter, and a state of emergency was called in our area. I tried and failed to make it to my fourth day of training. When I got there, barely on the fifth day of training by walking more than a quarter mile down an iced-up back road to get picked up to be taken to work, I was told they don't think I'm gonna work out there. I said, "Are you ducking kidding me?" I said it was a state of emergency and that I didn't live across the street from the store like the manager did. I was so pissed. I should have looked into suing for wrongful termination, but I said some rather more than colorful words expressing my displeasure when I was told I was fired. Story 45. The place had a point system. 7 points and they could fire you. You could work points down doing overtime. I was only available for certain days. Specified this in during my hiring, but they continued to schedule me on days I was working elsewhere. Sometimes they would remove the point, sometimes they wouldn't. Talked to everyone I could about it. HR, managers, scheduling people, they couldn't get their crap together. So I figured if they distribute care, I wouldn't either. Ended up with 3 times the points, so just waiting for them to fire me. Ended up working off the points that didn't fall off over time and found myself below 7 points. Got a call a few weeks later that I was being let go for having too many points. Story 46. I had a job working at a nonprofit shelter for women. I noticed when I worked overtime, I never got paid for it. When I asked, they told me that nonprofits don't have to pay overtime. I believed them. But one day, after about 2 years working there, I called the labor department about something else. While talking, I casually mentioned that I didn't make overtime. They asked where I worked and I told them. Then I said, "I don't want to report them or anything though." And the guy was like, "Yeah, that's out of your hands now." The next time I went to work, they screamed at me, fired me, wouldn't even let me go to my locker to get my stuff. But I did end up getting a back check for a couple $1,000s. Story 47. Got forced to take a promotion to a role I didn't want, using the exact opposite of my usual skill set. I was then slow as duck and miserable as I'm all numbers and analytics, and the new role was creative. After a few months, I was doing better in the role. Sales were great, but when my boss asked me how I was doing, I had a full mental breakdown, bawling my eyes out at how much I hated it. I was fired less than 2 weeks later, and she was out of state for 8 of the 10 days. Years later, looking back, it was absolutely the best thing that ever happened to me. Ducked that place, ducked that industry, and ducked the whole team that drove 23-year-old me to a full-on mental breakdown. Story 48. I didn't take my break at the right time because I was with a customer. Later that day, I refused a service call because it was near the end of my shift. It was going to take me 40 minutes to get there, and there was a no OT rule in effect. By the time I would have arrived, I'd be on OT. I was fired. I disputed with the union, and they said because I took my break at the wrong time, the decision held. My boss was an a-hole with a hit list of people he planned to fire. I was the last one, and I made it really hard for him to find cause. Story 49. I worked at Justice in the mall, little girl's clothing store, as the assistant store manager. I was 18 years old and right out of high school. I got fired the day before Christmas Eve because I didn't include one of my former jobs on my job application. I was talking to a coworker about my old job in casual conversation, and she brought this up to my manager, who then fired me about a half hour later in the break room. I was devastated as this was my first managerial job. The store where Justice was now sits vacant at the mall, which is mostly a dead mall now, and it does make me smile to walk past it now that it's empty. Everyone who worked there was underpaid and miserable. Story 50. I worked at Old Navy for maybe 3 months back in 2009. I was fired because I didn't show up for work one time. I literally could not leave the house. We had a major ice storm, and I lived on a dead-end dirt road in the middle of the woods. A large tree had fallen across the road, and we were always one of the last roads in town to get cleared anyway. I explained this to my manager. She accused me of lying and told me not to come back in. Story 51. My sales went up. It was an inbound call center. I made a slight change to the order in which I read the upsell offer paragraphs. I didn't change the words at all. My sales went up because I was giving the explanation and offer in a more logical order. Supervisor said, "Just read the script." I explained what I was doing and why. I showed the statistics. I suggested having the marketing group modify the script so everyone's sales could similarly improve. Supervisor said, "Just read the script." Technically, I quit before they could fire me, but I knew the paperwork was in progress. Story 52. This was back in the 90s. While hiking, I fell and sprained my ankle. My ankle turned black and blue, swelled up to almost 3 times its size, and I couldn't put any weight on it at all without falling over. Went to the doc, got crutches, got my ankle wrapped up, and given instructions to stay off of it as much as possible. Afterwards, went to my boss to tell them that I couldn't work until I healed up. Showed them my ankle. They told me if I wasn't willing to work like that I wouldn't have a job. So, fired for getting a twisted ankle. Got to love the lack of worker protections in the US. Story 53. Just after high school, working at a pizza chain, I was an assistant manager, trusted with hundreds of dollars a night. At some point, I had expressed interest in the wall clock, had the mascot on the clock face surrounded by neon lights. It was ridiculous, and I stand by it. Not long after, maybe a week, the clock was stolen. They fired me for stealing it. There were cameras in the lobby, directly facing the clock. The video shows a very much not me individual stealing it and walking out the front door. They concluded that I'd paid the person to steal it for me. I knew I could fight it, but I also just could not be bothered to give a crap. Story 54. I made 12 sample wedding cake cups for an order. To visualize, there are about 4 Oz cups filled with a pop of buttercream, 1 layer of filling, cake, then another pop. I forgot to add the layer of raspberry filling to them. So I skied the top icing off and was getting the cake out to add the layer when my boss comes over to me and starts yelling at me that I'm wasting product and I'm incompetent and to get the duck out. So I left. Over 2 ducking Oz of buttercream. That lady was a Karen as a person. Her shop closed about 6 months after I left, so I don't even worry about it. Haha. Story 55. For going to work. I interviewed with the GM of a restaurant, did the walk around, accept the offer, and got the company apron. Showed up for my first day, and the AM told me the GM never let him know anything. Took my apron. GM called me to fire me at the end of my first week for no call, no show. Story 56. I was working in a restaurant. We had just gotten a fancy 8-burner double oven range, all stainless worth the cast iron burner plates. My KM says to keep it looking nice, clean it every night and run the tops them through the dishwasher. Hey, those are cat iron. They'll rust if we do that. You're paid to act, not think. A week later, the owner's asking me why I told the KM running the tops would be a good idea. Thankfully, the rest of the kitchen was there to back me up on what actually happened. I was fired on the spot for not exerting myself enough to prevent damage to the business. Story 57, Walmart. Basically, I just swept the aisles all day and occasionally cleaned up spills. Got fired because I refused to clean up a crap explosion in the restroom. I got the whole "and other duties as assigned" speech. Told them, albeit jokingly, that I'm not certified to clean up biohazards. Got told that if I didn't do it, I can clock out forever. Dropped my broom and spat on it, then walked out of the store while tossing my yellow vest behind me. Didn't even clock out. Got mailed my final paycheck about a week later. Got paid for that whole day. Duck Walmart. Story 58. Not fired, but laid off because the company was downsizing. I was one of 2 in my department. I did quality work and was always in the office. The other guy was a slacker and would lie about work he did and didn't show up half the time. They let me go over him because he had been working there longer. Story 59, being fun. Worked in a chemistry lab and I brought in a CD player and we all brought in what we like and listened on and off throughout the day. Manager saw us enjoying our day and was, nope, we can't have that. Plus I was the latest hire and I seemed to bring everyone out of their shells in silence. We chatted and had fun, went to Luch together, etc. Lab was not open to the public, so it was just the 5 of us plus a supervisor who was totally okay with all of us. But no, I brought fun to the lab, so after my 6-month probation, I was out. Story 60. While not me, a CPA was fired for not falsifying records. Dude head dove into termination and walked out with integrity. The guy's literal name is Rock. Amazing guy. My manager was his adoptive daughter who quit the next day. They refused to do illegal white-collar crimes, and he blew the whistle on what they were doing. And the IRS does, in fact, not duck around. Edit. The company was essentially stealing from clients in a very complex way, and my department was selling customer data to Johnson & Johnson, who paid in computers, monitors, chairs, and oddly enough, paper. Story 61. Not me, but an old neighbor in the 90s. He and a bunch of young guys worked doing QA testing on video games. They'd basically play games all day and started betting on them. Not cash, but increasingly outrageous action. It ended with the kid losing a bet and had to drink his own urine. To his credit, he didn't back out and drank the piss. His boss found out and told him, dude, I like you, but I have to draw the line somewhere, and drinking your own urine on the job is where I'm drawing it. Not sure if he filed for unemployment. That would have been an interesting claim. Story 62. I got fired for stealing from my employer. Lottery tickets, cash from the drawer, food, you name it, I was taking it. Except I wasn't. The owner was a boomer with a deep dislike for certain things, including his wife and 4 daughters, and I was but a teenage girl. My boyfriend at the time worked there too. He quit right after I got fired in solidarity, he told me. Turns out, he was the one doing the stealing. When I asked him why, he called me an idiot for not knowing where the rent money was coming from. So after that, I was a single teenage girl. Story 63. Piping through the phone system. Pink Floyd echoes throughout a giant manufacturing plant that made earth-moving equipment. It was completely empty of employees because it was Christmas Eve. I was a security guard there in the early 90s. I just wanted to listen to some tunes as I was doing my rounds that night. I connected my boombox from the guard shack outside to the phone intercom system throughout. Phone jack on alligator clips, direct to terminals on telephone handset mic. Apparently, a big shot walked in for some reason that night, and I was canned the next day. It sounded amazing though, and worth it. Story 64. I got fired from a grocery store for being too enthusiastic. They said they didn't think it was a good fit, that maybe I should be a camp counselor. Joke's on them. I did go on to become a camp counselor, and I loved it. Story 65. Worked at a grocery store. On my first day, I put in a time-off request for 3 months in the future for my wife's college graduation. Followed up regularly with reminders to my supervisor. Week before when the schedule gets released, sure enough, I'm scheduled for that day. I told my boss, and she said tough and handed me a directory of employees to call to ask to cover my shift. I, of course, was not going to miss my wife's graduation and was fired. Story 66. I worked for a family-owned business ran by a husband and wife. The husband asked if I could go to the copy store to make copies of a bunch of flyers because the printer was broken. I come back about an hour later, and the wife is freaking out because I left the store on the clock. I show her the flyers and say, "The husband told me to go." He looks at me like a deer in the headlights and completely denies it. It was my second day. She fired me, honestly. I was lucky. It could have only gotten worse from there. Story 67. Hired to work on water pumps with no prior experience. I worked on pumps, welded frames for solar panels, and made systems for it. I laid pipe and installed sprinkler systems, installed pool systems, learned to use a forklift, sell plumbing stuff from the shop. I got fired for not knowing why the solenoid was not working, and spent half a day trying to fix it and then replaced it.